The Lost Tribes from Outer Space by Mark Dem. Part 1. Has the truth about God been deliberately withheld? Did ancient astronauts write the Bible? Is the Supreme Being a space traveler? Did Jesus attempt to thwart the grand plan? Were the angels of the Old Testament the military crew and inspectors of a spaceship? Was the birth of Isaac the result of a transplanted fertilized ovum in Sarah, a transplant made by an interstellar biogeneticist? Was there more than one Yahweh? Now, a remarkable new interpretation of the scriptures in the light of modern science reveals some dazzling new insights into history and predicts the possible and probable future of the earth. Chapter 1. First Enigma. A worried Pharaoh, whose name is lost to us, let us simply call him Pharaoh, as the Bible does, had thoughtlessly allowed the Hebrews to multiply. It was one of his predecessors who had let them settle in the country, as immigrant labor seemed valuable to him. Like his ancestors before him, Pharaoh was a bold builder. The time of the pyramids was already in the ancient past, but Egypt's rulers had kept the habit of constantly undertaking new projects, such as monuments and water systems, whose common denominators were gigantic size and technological skill. It is hard to say which is more admirable: Lake Morris, an artificial reservoir with an area of 100 million square feet, or the temples of Karnak and Philae. 5,000 years later, it is not certain that we could duplicate what the Egyptians did with crude pulleys and wooden winches. Pharaoh was a large consumer of human labor. The Hebrews were permanent residents in his country, and they were multiplying as they had been ordered to do at the beginning of biblical history. The self-reproducing machine is a stage of automation envisaged by theorists, but no board chairman would mention it to his stockholders without a smile if he wanted to keep their confidence. Pharaoh had such machines, but he was worried precisely because of the Hebrews' proliferation. The critical percentage had long since been passed. These Israelites have become too many and too strong for us. Exodus 1:9. He had no need of sociologists to make him alarmed at this disproportion and aware of its dangers. We must take precautions to see that they do not increase any further, or we shall find that, if war breaks out, they will join the enemy and fight against us, and they will become masters of the country. Exodus 1:10. Then racism was born. But the more harshly they were treated, the more their numbers increased beyond all bounds, until the Egyptians came to loathe the sight of them. Exodus 1:12. Pharaoh took successive measures. First, he tried to make the Hebrews die of overwork by ruthlessly imposing heavy labor on them. Then he practiced birth control by the barbarous method available to him: neither contraception nor abortion, but infanticide. He ordered Hebrew midwives to kill all boys at birth, allowing only girls to live. His order was overridden by the midwives' fear of Yahweh. They craftily told him stories he could not verify. Hebrew women, they said, did not give birth in the same way as Egyptian women. They expelled their babies before a midwife had time to come. Duped by the midwives, Pharaoh turned to the Nile, father of all fertility, and also a magnificent moving shroud capable of enveloping as many little corpses as one might consign to it. The Egyptians were ordered to carry out the death sentence. Naked baby boys with swollen bellies began floating by like fish on a polluted stream. Such was the beginning of the oppression that was to weigh down on the Jews unceasingly. The first massacre of the innocent took place around 1400 BC. Like Herod later, Pharaoh let one of the condemned victims escape, precisely the one who was to have great influence on the course of events. A man of the house of Levi fathered a male child who, through complicated circumstances, was spared the cruel fate decreed by Pharaoh. There was one alternative that Pharaoh either rejected or did not even think of: expelling the Hebrews from Egypt. He did not want to lose his labor force. Egypt became for Israel the house of slaves. When he was grown, the spared child had to perform great feats to open the path of exodus to his people. A ruler does not willingly give up his Jews. He prefers to oppress them at home, as history shows by many examples. If he has no Jews, he gets some. 800 years later, Nebuchadnezzar, not satisfied with having demolished Jerusalem, deported the elite of the kingdom of Judea to the banks of the Euphrates, where they stayed for half a century. The Jews were not the only people who underwent slavery and captivity in ancient times, but they were more deeply marked by the experience than others, for reasons that will gradually become apparent in this book. The most beautiful poems of distress have come from Jewish lips, as though that small persecuted people knew that their suffering was inevitable because it was linked to the mission they had been given. Greater than I cried aloud to God, greater than I cried to God, and he heard me. Greater than in the day of my distress I sought the Lord, greater than, and by night I lifted my outspread hands in prayer. Greater than I lay sweating and nothing could cool me. I refused all comfort. Greater than Psalm 77, when they had spread into Europe as the result of the first dispersion in the year 70, and then the uninterrupted storms that broke over them, of which the Islamic Holy War was the most decisive. The Jews became the favorite scapegoats of the countries where they were allowed to settle. In the intensely Christian Middle Ages, they were charged with deicide and accused of causing all sorts of incomprehensible disasters: bubonic plague, fires, bad harvests. Every year on Good Friday, the Comte de Toulouse sent for the local rabbi and slapped him publicly to avenge the death of his Christ. It was a venerated custom. When Catholic warriors began preparing to set off on a crusade to drive the Muslims out of places that had been made forever holy by the presence of Jesus, it occurred to them that the Saracens were not the only enemies of the faith. The sons of Israel also had a strong claim to the title, so they began slaughtering Jews for good measure and to get in some practice before they left. While they were still in Europe, their swords became dulled from use and had to be resharpened. In Germany, the slogan of the First Crusade was "Kill your Jew before you leave." Speyer, Worms, and Mainz were the first scenes of action for crusaders who had been blessed by their bishops to go off and fight in the Holy Land. The number of victims in that operation alone is estimated at 12,000, not counting Bohemia, where the Jewish community was wiped out. The taking of Jerusalem by the Crusaders was celebrated with a bonfire. The synagogue and everyone inside it were burned. I will not try to summarize the whole history of the cruelty inflicted on the Jews, but a few glimpses into the past will be useful to my demonstration. Let us consider Great Britain, where the Third Crusade was distinguished by the massacre of the Jews of York. Italy, where the 13th century popes erected segregation and persecution of Jews into a doctrine. France, where their most relentless enemy was the king himself. Which king? The one with a halo above his crown. Louis IX, known as Saint Louis. In obedience to the Lateran Council, Saint Louis forced the Jews in his kingdom to wear the equivalent of what was later the yellow star, an emblem visible from front and back, an ignominious mark that exposed them to the brutality of the populace. Jewish writings were burned. There was a gigantic auto-da-fe in Paris in 1242, and so were Jews themselves. They were herded into synagogues that were then set afire. In Germany, Jew roasters made a specialty of such massacres. Physical attacks were augmented by humiliations. Jews were confined to ghettos and deprived of such elementary rights as going where they pleased or raising their voices in the street. Their houses had to be marked, not with the blood of the Paschal Lamb, but with ridiculous signs, a coat of arms adorned with a donkey, for example. The French Revolution transformed the life of Jewish communities in France by giving their members full citizenship, but in part of Europe, harassment continued all through the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th, and it often turned into the kind of bloody, unspeakably cruel persecution that has given the word pogrom its sinister connotations. Jewish citizens may have thought that the end of their misfortunes had come in Germany, Austria, France, England, and elsewhere. But although the law no longer said they could be slaughtered, burned, or made to wear an ignominious emblem, anti-Semitism could still resort to more insidious forms of oppression: rumors, mockery, satire expressed in books or graffiti, little persecutions in schoolyards, the unofficial ostracism that keeps Jews out of certain activities and groups. Then came the greatest of all attacks against the Jews. Nothing less than their total destruction was planned and partially carried out by modern methods of extermination. When the Nazi adventure was over, one might have expected that the monstrousness of its enterprise would be followed by a reaction of equal intensity, that the Jews would be given too much after having had everything taken away from them, that the blood of their martyrs would give rise to privileges. It is true that they are protected by new laws, that a territory has been authoritatively carved out for them, and that they now have allies who openly support them. But anti-Semitism is still vigilant, ready to burst out again at any time. To sum up, all forms of oppression have been used against the Jews: massacre, torture, selective laws, economic persecutions, expulsion, refusal to let them leave a country where violence was being inflicted on them, segregation in ghettos, religious pressure, obligation to embrace a faith that was not theirs, destruction of their sacred books and places of worship, deportation, degrading measures, distinctive emblems, and other humiliations, not the least of which was the reduction of Jews to the state of merchandise. There was a time when the German emperors negotiated their Jews like bills of exchange, borrowing on them as Gogol's hero did on his dead serfs. And here is our first enigma. Why have the Jews been hated, despised, and persecuted for thousands of years? Why have peoples and regimes as different as St. Louis's France and Hitler's Germany, 7 centuries apart, been in agreement on one point? The Jews had to disappear. It is only fair to point out, however, that St. Louis allowed them to save their lives by becoming Christians, while the Nazis did not offer them that choice. Some will refuse to classify this as an enigma because anyone who carefully dissects history can always find direct reasons for each expulsion or pogrom. These reasons may be religious: desire to eliminate a community that accepts the same God and part of the same scriptures, yet is guilty of having put Jesus Christ to death; economic, desire to take over the wealth amassed by Jewish bankers; psychological, envy of Jewish wealth, need to make someone responsible for unexplained catastrophes; political, rejection of an international community that warps relations between states, or of a minority unsuited to integration, and so on. Yes, there is always a motive or a pretext capable of explaining, if not justifying, the heavy smoke of pyres and crematoriums that rises toward Yahweh's nostrils like a mockery of sacrifice. But that does not satisfy my curiosity, and I therefore maintain my enigma. All peoples have undergone harassment and violence at some point in their history. All ethnic groups and nations have paid their tribute of blood. Victims of torture have cried out their despair in all known languages. Let me make myself clear. The enigma consists in the continuity of persecution. The Jew, writes Albert Memmi, who is Jewish, was and still is to a great extent an oppressed person, the constant object of a potential threat. History can be regarded as a perpetual repetition, but often in different places and with different protagonists. In this case, however, the protagonists do not change, and the persecution is not repeated because it has never stopped. It might be said that the persecution has lasted because the Jewish people have lasted. Other ethnic groups have become mixed. Even the most distinctive peoples have been absorbed in the constant stirring of populations or have disappeared, leaving only their names to be revived by historians after excavations brought them out of oblivion. There are no more Celts, Romans, Egyptians, or Etruscans. Only the Jewish people, if they are a people, or the Jewish race, if that word can be used, and apparently it cannot if it is rigorously defined, have survived in spite of everything. But this does not explain the pervasive prejudice against them, and it only thickens the mystery by giving substance to the enigma I have stated. I will therefore leave that enigma in abeyance and go on to the next one. Chapter 2. Second Enigma. We have already encountered this enigma with regard to a question of terminology, for one cannot speak of the Jews without coming into conflict with words. Are they a nation, a race, a people, a religion, a family? In each case, we have to answer no. The term race is the one that must be handled most delicately for reasons that should not be involved. If someone is irritated by other people and reacts violently against them, if he likes or dislikes the inhabitants of a foreign country, or even those of another part of his own country, the idea of race is not at issue unless it has been turned into racism, and racism has been made an article of ideology. That is what has happened in the 20th century. It greatly complicates the task of anyone who wants to see the subject clearly. Disliking the Jews is now regarded as a racist attitude, while disliking the English, a feeling that is at least as frequent among today's Frenchmen, is not. The conclusion would seem to be that the Jews constitute a race and the English do not. According to Henri Valois, former director of the Museum of Man in Paris, the Jews are not and never have been a race from the anthropological point of view. Valois also mentions foreign admixtures, notably the massive conversions to Judaism that occurred in some countries during the Middle Ages. The Jews are not a nation either. The state of Israel contains only part of them. Those who remain scattered all over the world are not Israelis abroad. They maintain allegiance to the countries in which they have citizenship, nor a religion. There are many atheistic Jews in Israel and elsewhere. Our second enigma can be expressed as follows. What are the Jews? It is based on an obvious fact, and yet they exist. Albert Memmi writes in La Libération du Juif, do the Jews have a common language? Obviously not. Do they have a common territory? Number. Do they even have a religion? Number. Most Jews could not even recall the names of the main prophets, and so on. The trouble was that once the operation was over, the Jew, unlike the artichoke, was still intact. If there were definite physical characteristics belonging only to Jews, it would be easy to say, this man is a Jew, that one is not. But there are dolichocephalic Jews and brachycephalic Jews, curly-haired Jews and straight-haired Jews, dark Jews and blonde Jews, hook-nosed Jews and straight-nosed Jews. I will break off this list and turn to family names. What are we to think of a big book, published 10 years ago, whose obvious purpose is to give the reader a simple method of recognizing the Jews among his acquaintance by means of their names? But the method bogs down in the complexity of the problem, which is as great as that of physical traits, and the author, Roger Parafit, ends up copying the whole phone book. For my part, I am concerned not with knowing whether or not a given person is Jewish, but with discovering what it is that makes a Jew Jewish. Take the case of a Jew who has no distinctive physical traits and speaks only French or German. If he changes his name, converts to Christianity, and abandons his family forever, he will still feel Jewish. This is not simply my opinion. It is stated by all those who have tried to escape from their condition without ever succeeding. But is it not merely a personal feeling of the individual involved, indiscernible to others unless he gives himself away by some sign of uneasiness that comes from his deep misgivings? Memi says it is an objective condition, and the individual's acquaintances are seldom deceived. It does not take much for them to form a diagnosis. We must accept the obvious, considering only the facts. The quality of Jewishness is indefinable, and it does not correspond to any kind of common behavior, despite the character traits that are often considered to be specifically Jewish. Yet that quality causes a deep cleavage in our human race. There are Jews and there are others. Let me clear up one possible misunderstanding here. This book is not a sociological study, nor is it designed to cultivate with the ulterior motive of either stirring up or quelling anti-Semitic hatred, the difference I have just pointed out. The preceding observations are meant only to give a specific background to this formulation of our second enigma. No one knows what Jews are, yet they exist. Chapter 3. Third enigma. Little by little, I am moving toward a statement of my thesis. One more enigma, and we will hear the first click or the first cough of the engine before it begins, I hope, to run. Our third enigma is related to the Bible. I would be repeating what everyone knows if I were to dwell at length on the fact that the Bible has been a prodigious bestseller ever since the invention of printing. But it is a social point in our time that although in Catholic circles it is regarded as the Word of God, it has not suffered from the declining importance of those religions in recent times. The Bible has found a new market that has nothing to do with pious preoccupations. Editions in the form of weekly installments sold on newsstands are bought by people who never go to church. New translations done by teams of scholars who may be Jewish, Catholic, ecumenical, or without religious affiliation easily find buyers even though their price is often high. Bibles are given as wedding gifts. The Business Executive's Library contains one, standing between the Encyclopedia Britannica and the complete works of Victor Hugo or Zola, in a modern edition illustrated with 19th century engravings. As in the case of persecutions against Jews, it is easy to find direct reasons for the massive sale of the Bible at different times and to different buyers. A need to learn more about one's religion, love of fine bindings, the lure of advertising, a desire to be considered a cultivated person, the influence of Mormon propagandists, and finally the pure and simple enjoyment of reading. For while many people are content merely to buy the Bible and Les Miserables, others actually read them. Yet all these reasons combined do not account for the durability of the Bible's popularity. Some of them, in fact, might just as well have acted in the opposite direction. At the beginning of this century, it was commonly believed that Catholics were forbidden to read the Bible. Was it to distinguish them from the Protestants, who laid great stress on reading the Holy Scriptures? It seems that the clergy was at the origin of that prohibition. I see nothing surprising in it. What surprises me is that the Bible is not publicly burned, as St. Louis burned the Talmud. What interest did the Catholic hierarchy have in allowing free access to texts presenting a God who was not exactly the God of the Church? If they had reduced the Bible to the New Testament, they would have spared theologians and preachers the great efforts they have had to make to demonstrate that despite appearances, the cruel, vindictive, wrathful God of the Old Testament is kind and merciful, and to distinguish the historical, mystical, allegorical, and poetic meanings of Scripture. The state of archaeological research gives them a pretext for saying that Babylonian tradition is earlier, which seems to me far from having been proved. I will come back to the trend of demystification that appears among religious researchers as well as others. For the moment, what needs to be noted is that it took careful excavation to unearth the tablets on which Chaldean knowledge is inscribed, whereas the Bible was recopied countless times and has never had a period of oblivion. It has continuously been in circulation ever since it was written. The monuments of Egypt kept their secrets till the 19th century. Little was known about their builders until Champollion deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Bible has not been buried and then exhumed, coded, and then decoded. It passed from parchment to parchment after having been transmitted orally since remote times. Dead civilizations have nothing equivalent to it. What prodigious force was able to achieve that result? The privileged destiny of the Bible will form our third enigma. Why is it that this ancient message, floating on the sea of time, has reached us and is still sailing briskly along? How has such an old book succeeded in remaining so fresh and timely? By what miracle does it attract the blasé public of our time in the midst of the indifference into which religions have sunk? And what does that book speak of when we examine it closely? It deals with the creation of the world, the deluge, and the peopling of the planet Earth, and that necessarily concerns everyone. But those stories take up only the first 11 chapters of Genesis. After that, the whole voluminous work is devoted to the history of the little Jewish people, their conflicts with their neighbors, their slow settlement of a tiny country. There were thousands of wandering tribes like that one. Nomads migrated by the millions in historical times and before. Thousands of little states came into being and vanished. Some left traces of themselves only in scholarly libraries. Others have faded entirely from human memory. What special feature has made the history of the tribes of Israel remain in the limelight so long? The story of the creation of the world and the development of mankind before Abraham represents 1% of the Old Testament. Is that enough to explain why the whole book has survived intact? One is tempted to think that there is something more in the Bible than a treatise on cosmogony, a historical work, and a collection of fables and poetry. It unquestionably has literary value, but so do the Iliad and the Geste de Guillaume. If there is something more, what is it? The time has come to recall the notions of an inspired book, the Word of God, and a text dictated by a superior power. What if it were true? The enigma of the Bible is linked to that of the Jewish people. Each presents a picture of a singular destiny. Andrei Shiraki, a historian of Judaism, writes, "There is another dimension that the historian will often encounter here, that of the improbable, even the impossible. On the rock of eternity, where it is situated by the transcendence of its God, Israel, minute, vanquished, and dispersed, sees its personality and originality triumph in the confrontation of the centuries. It outlives all the empires and powers that try to crush it. We here find ourselves faced with the extraordinary. 1 plus 2 plus 3. Our first three enigmas combine to produce the first click. The destiny of the Jews is not like that of any other people. Its dominant trait is uninterrupted oppression, regardless of historical, geographical, or political circumstances. The destiny of the Bible is not like that of any other book. Like the Jewish people, the Bible has come through all the vicissitudes of history, from the remote depths of time to the present. The first click, still modest, but we are making progress. The key to the Jewish enigma is in the Bible, and that is where we must look for it. It was obvious, not very. Chapter 4, Fourth Enigma. I am not one of those who see the intervention of an occult superior power in all events. Yet between intention and chance, I have opted for intention. It is hard for me to believe that after a certain time, inert matter blindly transformed itself into a brain with its millions of neurons and a blue eye and a girl's smile. I have opted for the existence of a plan, a coordinating intelligence, because this seems to me the more realistic of the two hypotheses. I cannot understand why, in our time, a materialist is regarded as a thoughtful man who has discarded his illusions, while anyone who contradicts him is considered naive. Having said that, I will add that if a superior intelligence guided the evolution of matter and still sustains the world, it acts only on an elevated level and cannot be the same intelligence that keeps account of children's sacrifices and their parents' adulteries, opens a minister's Bible to the page where it wants him to choose the topic of his next sermon, and checks on the ablutions of a rabbi or an imam. The God of the Catholic Church is closer to the Supreme Being, who is the source of all existence and evolution, than the God of the Bible as he is presented to us. The Supreme Being, the Almighty, appears in the first few pages of Genesis. He seems to be the author of the first story of creation. But soon afterward, we see a change of behavior, and the least that can be said about it is that it gives food for thought. Let me explain myself. All through the first chapter and the beginning of the second, to the middle of the fourth verse, there is no ambiguity. The text presents the Creator of all things, the Almighty, whose thoughts are manifested directly and immediately by the appearance of something that had not existed before. The earth, the sun, the stars. Only the narrative form, probably chosen to make the account more comprehensible, is responsible for the introduction of time, of successive events, where there can only be instantaneity. God is eternal, he thinks, and the object of his thought is thereby given existence. He does not think of one thing and then of another. He thinks, he is, the world is. That is as far as I care to go along the path of metaphysics at this point. The Bible expressed the creation of the world by the Almighty as well as it could have been done. What is important for us to note, whatever our convictions may be, is that the God of the first chapter of Genesis is Pascal's God, Voltaire's watchmaker, the infinitely great and good being of the Christian catechism. Then the narrator abruptly launches into a second story of creation that does not tally exactly with the first. Bible scholars have detected the fusion of two different sources, which is understandable when we realize that the Bible was spoken before it was preserved in writing. It was transmitted orally for perhaps 10,000 years, a period we are not capable of measuring. But the change of author does not account for the lowered level. The second story of creation is not in keeping with the first. It seems, in fact, that the God of the second story is not the same as that of the first. The Hebrew names are different. Elohim gives way to Yahweh, or Yahweh, the Jehovah of Christian translations. This is not a serious matter in the first analysis. Since the Hebrews were forbidden to write God's name, the first writer designated it in one way, the second in another. Commentators are aware of this. They have called the first writer the Elohist and the second the Yahwist. This distinction is found in many other parts of the Bible. In the section of Genesis that we are now considering, however, the difference of names is important, and there is good reason to stress the fact that the story is told in different versions. Yahweh does not have the same functions as the Elohim of the first chapter. There is a fundamental difference between them. Elohim creates the sky and the earth, light, the succession of days and nights, the firmament atmosphere, plant life, the moon and the sun, animals, and finally man. It is all done in apparent disorder, but what seems disorderly to us may not be so from the viewpoint of a mode of thought different from ours. As for Yahweh, he plays a secondary role. He has two functions: improving the planet, he irrigates, he plants a garden, and forming man. But was man not created by the first God mentioned by Elohim? It seems so. Then why that second creation? That is our fourth enigma. It will set off the second click and lead me to formulate the hypothesis that is the source of this book. To put it in better perspective, let us return to Yahweh. He appears at the beginning of the second chapter, and from there to the end of the Old Testament, he is substituted for the Almighty who created the world. This Yahweh is designated by different names, including Elohim, sometimes in the plural, but it is impossible to confuse him with the supreme being who made the universe. First of all, he does not create. He formed a man from the dust of the ground. Genesis 2:7. That was how he gave birth to Adam, and he fashioned woman from man. He is a being who moves in the human manner. When he wants to speak with Adam, he goes to look for him in the garden and calls out to him, "Where are you?" This is not a God who knows and sees everything. When his product, Adam, fails to give him the satisfaction he expected, he regrets having made him. Yet Yahweh is not himself a man. He has vast scientific knowledge and immense powers. As we study him later in this book, we will see those powers and their limits. Yahweh might be defined as a humanoid immeasurably superior to man. He is not God. The confusion between him and God originated largely in the fact that they both came down from the sky. The question can be put in the form of a riddle. What resembles a man but is much more highly evolved, has scientific and technological knowledge far in advance of ours, and comes from the sky? I am not the first to say it, but that makes no difference. Yahweh strongly resembles a being from another planet with a civilization that has advanced to the stage where it can send explorers into space. Unexpectedly, it is the development of space technology and nuclear physics, more than archaeology, that has in recent years come to the aid of biblical interpretation. Other disciplines, such as biology, also give a hand to those who try to decipher the book over which so many eyes have grown dim. Until the middle of the 20th century, it would not have occurred to anyone to see Yahweh as a space traveler, or if someone had conceived the idea, he would not have dared to express it. Today we have only to reread the Bible in the light of that hypothesis to see that the many apparent contradictions in it disappear, and what was formerly obscure becomes dazzlingly clear. It is important to say explicitly here, though I will try to make it plain in the course of my exposition, that this is not the core of my thesis. The fourth enigma that must be resolved concerns Adam, who was formed from the dust of the ground at a time when man had already been created. I will take a great step forward by suggesting that this was a special kind of creation, the manufacture of a couple, a human breeding stock, from already existing materials into which Yahweh breathed the breath of life, his own. The couple thus formed did not correspond to a stage of natural evolution, like the men whom God had already placed on earth in the course of the six-day creation. After plants and animals, Yahweh performed a biological operation in accordance with a plan and a body of knowledge that he had brought with him. Adam and Eve can therefore be regarded as a breeding stock that he imported for a specific purpose. Let us here recall something of great importance. Yahweh, since the vowels are not written in Hebrew, I will respect the practice of using only the consonants, is in the opinion of all commentators, the national God of Israel. And now, with this in mind, let us consider the fact that the Old Testament is a Jewish book. As Josiane Charpentier aptly writes, these sacred texts refer almost exclusively to the Jewish people and show little concern with other peoples, except in relation to Israel. It is time for the second click. If instead of "then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground," we read "then Yahweh formed the Jews from the dust of the ground," all four of our enigmas are solved at once. On the earth created by God, a space traveler implanted a breeding stock to be the origin of his people, a distinct, chosen people, the Prince of Peoples, who were given special attention by that powerful being from elsewhere. The Jews are not of this earth, and that is why they have always been oppressed by other peoples. Their oppression is like the process of rejection that sometimes occurs in organ transplants. The Bible is not simply the story of one little people among others. The intense life that emanates from it and has forced men's attention for thousands of years comes from the hidden message it contains. I will try to throw some light on that message. What is a Jew? The product of a selective process carried out through the ages by methods that I will attempt to describe. The Jews come from space, and they will return there. Please stay tuned for part 2, coming soon. Peace, blessings, much love, and enlightenment to you all. Shalom.